There's a moment I still think about, even now, years after it happened. I've told this story at dinner tables and to strangers on trains, and every single time something in the room goes quiet when I get to the part where he moved. Because guards aren't supposed to move. That's the whole point of them. And that day, one of them did. Let me start from the beginning. It was the last week of spring in the kingdom of Aldenmore, and the city of Harrogate was doing that thing it does when the weather finally turns. Everyone spills outside like they've been let out of school. The great grey stone of Wexford Palace sat at the top of the square, catching the sun in a way that made the whole building look almost warm, which, if you know Wexford Palace, is a rare thing. Usually it looks like it's judging you. I was there because my niece Posy had begged me. She was 7, obsessed with the palace guards, and it was her birthday coming up. Her actual birthday, I should say, because the whole reason the crowd was there that day, the reason it was busier than usual, was another child's birthday entirely. Prince Thomas, the youngest of the royal children. He was turning 6, and word had gone round the city that there'd be a small public appearance on the palace balcony, a wave, maybe some music. Nothing grand. But people love a small grand thing. So the square was packed. I remember the smell of it more than anything. Roasted nuts from the cart near the fountain. Someone spilled lemonade going sticky and sweet on the cobbles. That particular Harrogate smell of old stone and pigeons, and too many people wearing sunscreen. Posy had my hand in a grip that could have cracked a walnut, and she kept jumping, trying to see over the shoulders in front of us. "Can you see him yet?" she kept asking. "The guard, the tall one, is that him?" They all looked tall from where we stood. The guards themselves lined the front of the palace in their red tunics and those tall black bearskin hats that make them look like they're not entirely real. You've seen them, or ones like them. The whole trick of them is the stillness. A child could stand in front of one and pull faces for 20 minutes and the guard wouldn't so much as twitch an eyebrow. It's discipline turned into a kind of art. People find it funny. I've always found it a little bit sad, if I'm honest, all that training, all that pride, just to stand there and be photographed. One of them stood closer to us than the rest, younger than I'd expected, though it was hard to tell under the hat. There was something about the way he held himself, though, straighter, if that's even possible, like he meant it more than the others. I found out his name later, Corporal Ellis Vane. But that day, to me, he was just the tall one Posy kept pointing at. Around noon, things started to shift. You could feel it before you could see it, that ripple that goes through a crowd when something's changing. Heads turning, phones coming up, a murmur that started at the front and rolled back toward us like a wave hitting the shore. The great doors at the top of the palace steps had opened, and figures were coming out onto the raised terrace above the square. Posy nearly climbed up my arm. I lifted her onto my shoulders, which my back has never forgiven me for, and she gasped in that pure way only children gasp, like the whole world had just handed her a present. "It's the prince, it's the little prince." And there he was, Prince Thomas, 6 years old that very day, in a little blue coat with brass buttons, holding the hand of a woman I recognized as Lady Marjorie Felding, a senior figure in the royal household, the kind of woman who ran things. Sharp face, sharper posture, the sort of person who looked like she'd never once been late for anything and had opinions about people who were. There was supposed to be a party. That was the thing everyone in the crowd knew. Not the public just got the balcony wave, but the party itself, the real one, was meant to happen inside afterward. Cake, other children, the whole thing. Someone near us who claimed to have a cousin in the palace kitchens had been telling anyone who'd listen about the cake. 3 tiers, shaped like a sailing ship because the little prince loved boats. Tomas was practically vibrating up there. You could see it even from the ground. A 6-year-old on his birthday, about to be waved at by an entire city. His free hand was doing that flappy, excited thing kids' hands do. And then Lady Felding leaned down and said something to him. I couldn't hear it, obviously. Nobody could. But I watched it land on that little boy's face like weather. You know how a child's face is completely open, no filter between what happens inside and what shows outside. One second he was lit up like the morning. The next, something went out of him. His shoulders dropped. His chin dropped. That flappy little hand went still and then curled up against his chest like it was trying to hide. The murmur in the crowd changed. People sensed these things. 100 conversations sort of paused at once. Then Lady Felding straightened up, said something to the aides behind her, and just turned the boy around. Hand on his shoulder, firm, steering him back toward the doors. Not cruelly, exactly. Not shouting. Just that cold, administrative efficiency of an adult who has decided something and expects it to be done. The party was off. You didn't need to be told. You could read it in the whole shape of what was happening up there. The aides scattering, one of them already pulling the terrace doors wider, another gathering up what looked like decorations that had been half arranged along the railing. Later the story got told 100 different ways. Some said there'd been a scheduling problem. Some said the little prince had done something to be punished. The version that seemed to settle as the truth was simpler and worse. An important guest hadn't arrived, or a diplomatic thing had come up, and the household had decided the birthday simply wasn't convenient today. It would be rescheduled. Which, when you're 6, might as well mean never. When you're 6, there's only ever now. But here's the part I keep coming back to. As Lady Felding turned him around, the little prince looked back, over his shoulder, down at the square, at all of us, at the whole city that had shown up in the sunshine to celebrate him. And on his face was the specific, terrible confusion of a child who's just learned that being loved by a crowd and being cared for up close are two completely different things. Posy on my shoulders said in her small, clear voice that carries the way children's voices do, "Why is he sad? It's his birthday." And a few people around us laughed the way you do when a child says the sad, true thing out loud. But it wasn't really a laughing kind of quiet that came after. The boy was almost at the doors now. And that's when I noticed the guard. Corporal Vane, the tall one. He hadn't moved, of course he hadn't, they never move, but I happened to be looking right at him and I saw something almost no one else in that square would have caught. His jaw, just his jaw, it tightened, the smallest thing. A muscle in his cheek jumped and held. His eyes, which are trained to look at nothing at the middle distance, at the great forever of standing at your post, his eyes had gone up. To the terrace. To the boy. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this bigger than it was in the moment. He didn't shout. He didn't break ranks. Not yet. It was just a man's face doing the one small thing his training couldn't quite hold down. But I saw it, and I nudged the stranger next to me, an older gentleman with a folded newspaper, and I said, "Look at that guard." And the older man looked, and he went quiet too. Because once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. This wasn't a statue. This was a person. A person watching a child be turned away from his own birthday, and feeling something about it, and being bound by every rule of his uniform and his post and his kingdom to do absolutely nothing at all. The doors at the top were open now. The little prince was being guided through them. 10 more steps and he'd be gone, inside, swallowed up by the cool dark of the palace, and whatever cancelled afternoon waited for him there. 9 steps. 8. I felt Posy's hands tighten in my hair. The whole square seemed to be holding one enormous breath, though I don't think most of them even knew why. That's the strange thing about crowds. They feel the important moment before they understand it. 7 steps. And Corporal Ellis Vane, 24 years old, 3 years in the king's service, standing at the post he'd been so proud to earn that his mother still had the photograph on her mantle. Corporal Vane did something that no guard in the history of Wexford Palace had done during a royal appearance. He turned his head. Fully, deliberately, away from the crowd, away from his forward-facing post and up toward the terrace. It doesn't sound like much when I say it like that, but you have to understand what it meant. In that world, on that ground, a guard turning his head during a royal presentation was like a church bell ringing at the wrong hour. It was wrong in a way that made people gasp before they even knew what they were gasping at. The sergeant of the guard, a barrel-chested man positioned near the palace steps, snapped his eyes toward Vane. You could see him register it, the impossible thing, one of his men breaking form in front of the entire city. And up on the terrace, something made Lady Feldane pause. Maybe it was the change in the crowd. Maybe it was instinct. But she stopped, one hand still on the little prince's shoulder, and she looked down into the square to find the source of whatever had shifted the air. Her eyes swept the front rank of guards and landed on the one who was looking back at her. For a moment, just a moment, the entire square of Harrogate held still. The nut cart stopped its sizzling. The pigeons, I swear, stopped their pigeoning. A city of thousands and a woman on a terrace and a small sad prince and one guard who had turned his head, all suspended together in the last minute before everything changed. Posy leaned down close to my ear. "What's he doing?" she whispered. I honestly didn't know, but I knew I was about to find out. And I knew, the way you know these things in your bones before your brain catches up, that I was standing in the middle of a day I would be telling people about for the rest of my life. I just didn't know yet that it would end with the whole crowd falling silent. Or why? I need to back up for a second, because to understand what Corporal Vane did next, you have to understand who he was. And I only learned all this afterward, piece by piece, from people who knew him. Ellis Vane grew up in a nothing sort of village 3 hours north of Harrogate, the kind of place with one shop and a lot of sheep. His father drove a delivery lorry. His mother cleaned rooms at a hotel that catered to people passing through to somewhere better. Ellis was the boy who stood too straight in school photographs, the one who took things seriously when the other kids were laughing. He wanted to be a palace guard from the age of 8, when his gran took him to Harrogate for his birthday, and he saw the red tunics and decided, the way children decide impossible things, that he would wear one someday. And he did, against the odds, against the competition, against a selection process that turns away far more than it takes. He earned it. That photograph his mother kept on the mantel, Ellis in full uniform, jaw set, eyes forward. She used to make guests look at it whether they wanted to or not. Here's the thing about a man like that. When you want something that badly and you finally get it, you don't throw it away lightly. Whatever Vane did up there, he didn't do it because the rules meant nothing to him. He did it because, in that one moment, something meant more. So back to the square. Vane had turned his head. The sergeant had seen it. Lady Feldane up on the terrace had found him with her eyes, and for that long suspended moment nobody moved. Then Vane broke his post. He didn't run, that's important. He didn't do anything wild or panicked. He brought his rifle down from his shoulder in one clean, practiced motion. The motion of a soldier, not a man losing control, grounded it and stepped out of the line. 1 step, 2. Out of formation, onto the open stone of the square, in full view of thousands. The gasp that went through the crowd was a physical thing. I felt it move past me like wind. The sergeant moved at the same instant, striding toward him from the palace steps, and I could see his mouth forming the word "corporal" sharp and low, a command meant to freeze Vane where he stood. In that world, a sergeant's voice at that pitch was the voice of God. Men did not disobey it. Vane stopped, but he didn't turn back. He looked up at the terrace, at the little prince who had also stopped now, twisted round in Lady Feldane's grip to stare down at the extraordinary sight of a guard out of formation. 6 years old, tears not yet fallen but standing in his eyes, looking down at this one red-coated man who had, for reasons the boy couldn't possibly have understood, just done the one thing guards never do. And Vane spoke. Now I was maybe 40 feet away, and there was a whole crowd between us, so I want to be honest and say I didn't catch every word with my own ears. But he spoke loudly, deliberately loudly, the trained, carrying voice of a man on a parade ground, pitched to reach the terrace above. And enough people around me heard it and repeated it in the minutes and hours after that. I'm confident I have the shape of it right. He looked up at the little prince and he said, "Happy birthday, Your Highness." That was all 4 words. But you have to hear it the way the square heard it, because a guard is not permitted to speak to the royals during a presentation. A guard is not permitted to speak at all. A guard is a fixed point, a silent thing, part of the furniture of the palace. For one of them to lift his voice and offer a birthday wish to a child being turned away from his own party, it broke a rule so fundamental that half the crowd didn't even know it was a rule until they watched it shatter. The sergeant reached him, put a hand on his arm. I saw Vane's head turn toward the older man, and I saw him say something back, quieter this time, just between the two of them. Whatever it was, the sergeant didn't drag him off. He didn't. He stood there, gripping Vane's arm, caught between duty and something else, and he hesitated. That hesitation told me the sergeant had a heart in him too. Up on the terrace, Lady Felding had gone rigid. This was a disaster for her, you understand. A public one. Her carefully managed non-event, her tidy little cancellation, had just been blown wide open in front of the entire city by a corporal in the ranks. Her face, I could see it even at that distance, had gone the particular white of someone whose control has just slipped out of their hands. And the little prince pulled loose. Just for a second. He tugged his shoulder free of her hand, stepped to the terrace railing and looked down at Corporal Vane. And he lifted his small hand and he waved. Not a royal wave, not the practiced little turn of the wrist they teach them. A real one. A child's wave. Fingers spread, arm going hard, the wave you give someone you're glad to see. The crowd made a sound I've never quite heard before or since. Something between a laugh and a sob. Thousands of people all feeling the same thing at once, and none of them able to hold it in. I had tears on my face. I didn't notice them arrive. The older gentleman beside me with the newspaper had taken his hat off, which I didn't understand at the time and understood completely later. It was the only thing his body could think to do. Posey, on my shoulders, was clapping, and then a few other people were clapping. And then it spread, the way fire spreads across dry grass, from the front of the square outward, until the whole of Harrogate was applauding a guard who had broken every rule of his post to tell a sad little boy that his birthday still mattered. That should have been the end of it, a beautiful moment, a story to tell. But it wasn't the end, because the household still had to answer for what came next, and so did Vane. Lady Felding recovered fast. I'll give her that. She stepped back from the railing, gathered the prince more gently now, I noticed, or maybe she just knew the whole city was watching her hands, and she snapped an order to the aides. And within a minute, senior figures were moving, not toward the doors, toward the terrace edge. Someone had gone to fetch someone. The crowd didn't disperse. Nobody left. We all stood there in the sunshine, sensing that the thing wasn't finished. And then a new figure came out onto the terrace. I knew him at once. Everyone did. It was the boy's grandfather, the king. I won't pretend I can tell you what the king had seen or how much he understood in that first moment. Maybe he'd been watching from a window. Maybe an aide had rushed to him. But he came out onto the terrace with the slightly stiff walk of an older man moving faster than he's used to, and he went first, not to Lady Felding, not to the aides, but to his grandson. He crouched down. Right there, in front of the whole square, this old man in his fine clothes got down to the boy's level and put a hand on the side of his face and said something to him. And the boy, who had been so carefully holding himself together, finally cracked and buried his face in the old man's shoulder. The king held him for a long moment. He just held the boy while the entire city watched. Then he stood, and he looked down into the square, and he found, exactly as his grandson had, the one red-coated figure standing out of formation on the open stone. I have thought about what happened next more than almost anything else in my life. The king raised his hand. Not to summon, not to command. He raised his hand to Corporal Vane the way you'd raise a hand to someone across a room you were glad to see, an acknowledgement, a greeting, a small human salute from one man to another. And then, unmistakably, he inclined his head. A nod. a bow almost small as it was. The King of Aldenmore bowed his head to a corporal. I heard the sergeant beside Vane let go of his arm. And I understood, watching it, that Vane wasn't going to be dragged off in disgrace. Whatever came after, and there would be an after, there always is, in that moment, in front of the whole city, the king had made his feeling plain. The guard had done something wrong by every rule in the book, and the king had looked at it and decided that this time, the rules had been on the wrong side. I felt Posy's hands loosen in my hair. She'd gone very still, watching, the way children go still when they can tell something matters even if they can't name it. "Is he in trouble?" she whispered. And I said honestly, "I don't know, love," because I didn't, not yet. Up on the terrace, the king straightened, kept one hand on his grandson's shoulder and turned to Lady Feldon. And whatever he said to her, we couldn't hear a word of it, but we could read her face. And her face was the face of someone being told, quietly and completely, that they had made a serious mistake. Then the king did the thing that turned the whole day from a story into a legend. He turned back to the crowd. He lifted the little prince up, actually lifted him, this old man, up onto the low ledge of the terrace so the whole square could see him properly. And he called down, in a voice that carried the way Vane's had, a voice used to being heard. "My grandson is 6 years old today." The square erupted. I mean it erupted. A roar went up from thousands of throats, a wall of sound bouncing off the old stone of Wexford Palace, and people were cheering and clapping, and some of them were singing. Someone started the birthday song and it caught, ragged and beautiful, thousands of strangers singing to a little boy they'd never met, on a terrace above a sunny square, because one guard had reminded them all that he was just a child, and it was just his birthday, and that ought to be enough. I sang, badly. Posy sang at the top of her lungs. The older gentleman with the newspaper sang with his hat still off and tears running freely down into his collar, and not one bit of shame about it. And down on the open stone, Corporal Ellis Vane stood at attention. He'd come back to attention the moment the king appeared, some instinct pulling him upright, and I watched the discipline hold his body perfectly still while it could do absolutely nothing about his face. He was crying too, standing straight as a flagpole in his red tunic, eyes forward, jaw set the way it was in his mother's mantelpiece photograph, and crying without a sound while a whole city sang. That's the image I've carried for years, not the drama of him breaking post, not the king's bow, that. A young man who'd wanted one thing his whole life, standing at the post he'd nearly thrown away, weeping quietly while the thing he'd risked it all for played out above him. A sad boy made happy again in front of everyone. But I told you the crowd fell silent, and it did. That came after all the noise. That came at the very end. I'll tell you about that in the last part, what happened when the singing stopped, what the king did next, and the thing Vane said when it was all over that I've never once been able to forget. The singing has to stop eventually. That's the thing about a moment like that, it burns so bright you think it'll last forever, and then it doesn't, because moments never do. The birthday song wound down the way crowd singing always does, trailing off in patches, a few stubborn voices holding the last note, and then a big ragged cheer to cover the awkwardness of not knowing what comes next. And then the square did something strange. It went quiet on its own. Not because anyone hushed it, not because anything went wrong. It just settled. Thousands of people all at once seemed to understand that the loud part was over and something else was beginning, and they lowered their voices without being asked, the way a room quiets when someone stands to give a toast. Because the king had raised his hand again, and this time when he spoke, he wasn't speaking to the crowd about his grandson. He was looking down at Corporal Vane. "Come up," the king said. 2 words, and they landed in that fresh silence like stones dropped in still water. You could hear them ripple outward as people at the front repeated them back to the people behind. "Come up." He said, "Come up." The king's calling the guard up. Vane didn't move at first. I think he genuinely didn't understand that it was meant for him. A corporal does not get called up onto a royal terrace. It doesn't happen. It's not a thing that exists in his world. He stood there at attention, eyes forward, until the sergeant beside him, the same sergeant who'd gripped his arm to stop him minutes before, leaned in and said something, and gave him a small push between the shoulder blades. And Corporal Ellis Vane, in front of the entire city of Harrogate, walked up the palace steps. I have never in my life watched anyone walk the way he walked those steps. Every eye in that square was on him. Thousands of people holding their breath again, watching this young man in his red tunic climb toward the king with his rifle grounded and his bearskin hat and his face doing its absolute best to hold itself together and failing at the edges. He was terrified. You could see it. And he went anyway. Which, I've come to think, is more or less the whole definition of courage, being terrified and going anyway. He reached the terrace. He stopped in front of the king and snapped to attention so hard I heard his boots come together from where I stood. And the little prince, Tomas, 6 years old that day, looked up at this enormous red-coated soldier who had waved at him and wished him happy birthday. And he did the thing that only a child would do. He walked straight up to Vane, wrapped both arms around the man's leg and hugged him. The square made that sound again, the laugh sob, the one thousands of people make together when their hearts go all at once. Vane looked down, and you could see the war on his face, the training screaming at him to stay at attention, to not move, to not respond, and the simple human fact of a small boy hugging his leg. And the human fact won. Slowly, carefully, like he was handling something that might break, Corporal Vane lowered one white-gloved hand and rested it on the little prince's head. That was when the silence became something holy. I don't know how else to describe it. A city square is never truly silent. There's always traffic somewhere, a bird, a cough, a child. But in that moment it came as close as I have ever heard a crowd come to perfect stillness. Thousands of people watching one soldier rest his hand on one small boy's head, and nobody wanting to be the one to break it. The king let it stand for a moment. Then he spoke, and because it was so quiet, his voice reached even to the back. "You broke your post, Corporal." "Yes, your Majesty." Vane's voice, steady. He didn't make excuses, he didn't explain, he just agreed. "Yes, I did the thing I'm not allowed to do, I know it." "Why?" And the whole square leaned in for the answer. Vane was quiet for a second. Then he said, and I've turned this sentence over in my head 1,000 times since, he said. "Because a child ought to know that someone stood up for him on his birthday, your Majesty, even if it was only me. Even if it was only me." I told you I'd never forget the thing he said, and that's it. That's the sentence. Even if it was only me. As though he were the least of everyone there. As though a corporal from a village with one shop couldn't possibly matter enough to be the one who stepped in. And that was exactly why it mattered so much. Because he did it thinking he was nobody, and it turned out he was the only one in the whole square with the courage to be somebody. The king looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the crowd and he said, loud enough for all of us, "There will be a party." That was it. 4 words again, funny, how the day kept coming down to 4 words. There will be a party. And the square went up one final time, the biggest roar of the whole day, because the wrong had been made right in front of everyone, out loud. By the one man with the power to do it. I found out later how the rest of it went. The party happened, the real one, the sailing ship cake and all. The little prince got his birthday. Lady Felding was quietly moved on from her role within the month. The palace never said why and never had to. Everyone knew. And Corporal Vane. I'll be honest, this is the part people always want reassuring about, and I'm glad I can give it to them. He wasn't punished. Not really. There was a formal review, there had to be. You can't have guards breaking post whenever their hearts move them, and even Vane understood that. He said as much afterward, in the one interview he ever gave. He said the rules mattered and he'd been wrong to break them, and if it happened again, he'd probably do the same thing and take whatever came. And he seemed completely at peace with both of those facts being true at once. The review found that his conduct, while a breach, had been in the highest tradition of service to the crown. That's the official phrase. It went in his record, which means that somewhere in the palace archives there is a document that says, in dry official language, that the day Corporal Ellis Vane broke every rule of his post was one of the finest things a guard ever did. He kept his job. He was promoted, eventually Sergeant Vane, then something higher I lost track. His mother, I'm told, got a new photograph for the mantel, Ellis on the terrace, his hand on the little prince's head, the king beside them. She made guests look at that one too. Posey still talks about it, and she's grown now with children of her own. She was 7, up on my shoulders, and she saw a guard step out of line to be kind to a stranger, and I think it did something to her that never wore off. She works with children now. Make of that what you will. As for me, I came for a birthday wave, and I got something I've spent years trying to explain to people who weren't there. The best I've ever managed is this. We build these traditions, don't we? These rules, these still silent men in their tall hats who aren't allowed to move. And most of the time the rules are right and the stillness is a kind of beauty, and everything runs the way it's meant to. But every so often the rules point one way and the right thing points the other, and in that gap you find out what a person is actually made of. Everyone in that square that day was a person. Thousands of us. And we all saw the boy's face fall, and we all felt something, and we all did exactly nothing, because that's what you do. You're just a face in a crowd, it's not your place. Someone else will handle it. Only one of us wasn't willing to leave it to someone else. And the strange, wonderful thing is that he was the one person there who had the most to lose by acting, and the least standing to act at all. Just a corporal. Just a boy from a village up north who'd wanted one thing his whole life and was ready to risk it for a stranger's kid on the stranger's birthday. Even if it was only me. I think about that whenever I see something wrong and feel that little tug to look away. Whenever I tell myself it's not my place, someone else will handle it, I'm nobody. And then I remember a red tunic stepping out of line in the spring sunshine. And I remember that the world doesn't change because the important people finally do the right thing. It changes because someone who thought they were nobody decided that a child ought to know he was worth standing up for. Even if it was only them.